Morning, everyone. I'm Mike Raven. So we'll start the seminar in a couple of minutes. I think we'll just give you a couple more minutes just to let people join. I think we've already got about 20 attendees now. I know we did have quite a few registrations for this course this morning. So it's always a bit interesting in terms of whether people use Teams or Zoom. So sometimes it takes them a couple of minutes just to get used to the system. So we'll make a start. I think I've planned probably about 9:35. So we'll just go. Feel free to go and grab a drink, and so we'll make a start in 3 or 4 minutes. Hi to anyone who's just joined. I'm Mike Raven. So we're going to be starting the seminar in a couple of minutes' time. We're just allowing anyone who's not got on yet just to get joined. I can see we're up to about 45 in terms of attendees. I think we did have quite a few registrations for the course. So we'll just give you a couple more minutes and we'll make a start. Okay, so I think we'll make a start. So if you just joined, I'm Mike Raven. We're going to do a little bit of introductions in a moment, but there's myself and my colleague Phil Henderson from East Riding Council here today, just to give you a bit of a chat about the NEC3. We're also assisted by our colleague Katie Robinson. So Katie's just going to be keeping an eye on questions and keeping track of those. So what we'll probably do in terms of questions, because we have got quite a few attendees on this session today, so it's going to be a lot of myself and Phil talking and going through our slides. We've got a good bit of time at the end for Q&A. Depending on how we get through the slides, we might try and fit in another Q&A session halfway through, but we'll see how time goes, if that's okay with everyone. So just to give an idea of what we're going to be doing in terms of content today. Brilliant. So we'll do our introduction to just a little bit about myself and Phil for anyone who hasn't met us before. I'll just do a little bit of detail about G4C as well, which I know a lot of people on the call will have joined us through G4C, but there might be some people who are just wanting to know a bit more about the initiative. We'll go into the background for the NEC suite of contracts, so kind of, how have we got to NEC3. We'll go into the structure of it, and then the main features is probably the bulk of the presentation. So we've got a bit of a chunk about the main features, about the program and those kind of areas. We'll take a little bit of a break just to give people a chance for a comfort break or to grab a drink. We'll then carry on with the rest of the features. We'll be going through compensation events. We'll be going through early warnings. We'll be going through float. So there's quite a bit of content that we'll be providing today. We won't spend too long on this, but we will kind of touch on the choice of NEC. So why the use of NEC at East Riding Council? We've been using NEC almost exclusively for quite a few years now. I've been with the council 20 years, and pretty much every project I've done has been under NEC. We will also touch on the kind of the main changes from NEC3 to NEC4, just for anyone who's interested in that. Obviously NEC4 has been released and it's been around for sort of 3 or 4 years now, and it's something that we're moving to in the near future. So my team's been training up on NEC4 and to prepare for that. And then, as I say, we've got quite a bit of time dedicated at the end to Q&A. So for anyone who wants to ask questions, if you can, just pop them into there should be a Q&A facility as part of this live event. So pop them in there. Katie will be checking the questions and making them live. Please, I would encourage you to look at the questions that other people are asking, and feel free to upvote them as well. If you think I really want the answer to that question, do kind of feel free to do that, because what we'll be doing is looking at the most liked questions. We'll be tackling those ones first. I think you automatically muted it anyway. We will be looking to share the presentation afterwards through G4C. So I think that's kind of all the key housekeeping. So just in terms of profile, and just to give you a bit of flavour about ourselves. So myself, I'm the principal project manager at East Riding Council. So I head up a team of project managers and clerk of works. We deliver 40 to 50 million pounds worth of construction work per annum. Those schemes range from £60,000 projects up to £20 million projects. So we do quite a range of jobs, all under the NEC. As you can see on the slide there, I do have the various sort of badges and gongs related to administering the NEC and project management, and also in terms of G4C, which I'll talk about in a moment. I'm on the Yorkshire Committee for G4C, and I was the former chair. So, Phil.
Hi, I'm Phil Henderson. I work with Mike at East Riding of Yorkshire Council, where I'm an assistant principal engineer in our construction management team. My role is primarily focused on the contracting side, so procurement side. So I do have day-to-day involvement with the NEC contract from a tendering and procurement perspective. Similar to Mike, got various different accreditations for NEC. I'll be doing the accreditation for NEC4 in the next couple of weeks to become an accredited project manager, and I've not quite worked with NEC as long as Mike, but I do have 10 years or coming up to 10 years experience now of working with the NEC, delivering the council's capital delivery programme, not just on the building side, but civil engineering and also professional services as well. So that's a bit of an introduction and background from me. I'll pass you back to Mike now just to explain a bit more about what G4C is.
Thanks, Phil. So yes, I mean, just briefly for anyone who's on today, so it's a G4C, or Generation for Change. It's the young professional voice of the UK built environment industry. It's part of Constructing Excellence, so it's very much about giving those new entrants to the industry the kind of the support and the training, the sort of experience that they need to really change and improve the industry as best they can. As I think we're all aware, construction it's a very fragmented industry. You have, on any successful project, you have tens, if not hundreds, of different contractors and certainly hundreds of different people working to deliver that project, right from your main contractors and your clients and designers through to your individual subcontractors and suppliers. So it's really trying to bring those people together and gear them up, as I say, with the training that they need. And we're very pleased to be able to support G4C today in terms of providing this NEC training. It runs across 12 regions of the UK, providing this free training. Both myself and Phil, we're in the Yorkshire region, so as I say, we've been working with the Yorkshire committee for many years. I think we're pleased that with this, this webinar, obviously it's been promoted via the Yorkshire region, but I think we've got other regions dialing in as well. So welcome to anyone who's on today. And I would really encourage anyone who'd like to hear more about G4C, or maybe how to get involved, or maybe there's something that we could do to support your young people, whether they're at university, college, they've just started in your organisation. Feel free to head over to the website and drop us a message. I know we've got the Yorkshire Awards in a couple of weeks, which we're looking forward to going to. So by all means, if anyone's coming to that, I think me and Phil will see you there.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Mike, for explaining a bit about G4C. I'm just going to switch now to the presentation today, just to give you a flavour of what we're going to be focusing on. And the main focus is going to be on the engineering and construction contract, which is used primarily for works and is often referred to as the ECC. So you might hear us using that abbreviation throughout the presentation today. There are other contracts in the NEC suite for maintenance, term contracts, and for professional services, but we won't really be discussing them today. We're also focusing on NEC3 today, but we will be explaining a little bit about the differences between NEC3 and NEC4. They aren't huge, but we will be touching on those in a little bit. The presentation today is aimed at those who are relatively new to NEC, so we don't go into it sort of in a clause by clause way, but we are hoping to provide more than just a very basic overview. Although we are a little restricted by time today, so the topics covered won't be exhaustive, so therefore we do need to just sort of say that you should not rely on this presentation as a substitute for legal or professional advice. If you are looking for more in-depth training or help with resolving a particular issue, then do get in touch and we'll be happy to help and pick that up with you separately. So back to today's programme, we're now just going to move on to the background to the NEC suite of contracts. So the NEC, or the New Engineering Contract, was first published in 1991. We're now on the 4th edition, which was published in 2017, and it's subsequently been revised twice, once in 2019 and again in 2020. Despite being around since 1991 and also being able to trace its foundations even further back to previous ICE forms of contract, the NEC suite of contracts is still thought of as a relatively new set of contracts. And one of the primary aims of the NEC, and it's really one of the reasons why it was created and drafted, it was drafted to create and facilitate a partnering ethos within the contracting process. And it's through this partnering ethos that it's hoped that project delivery can be improved and that fewer disputes will arise. As a result of this partnering ethos, it's endorsed by the Cabinet Office, and it's one of the predominant forms of contract that's used by the public sector. And on the screen now, you see the endorsements taken from the front of the NEC3 and NEC4 contracts. As well as being endorsed by various organisations such as the Cabinet Office, as Mike alluded to, the NEC is also the default form of contracts for a number of organisations, especially across the public sector, and East Riding of Yorkshire Council is one of those organisations. So Why do all of those organisations and the Cabinet Office endorse the use of a standard form of contract? Well, the simple answer is that construction is a complex profession. So having standard forms of contract makes it easier for construction professionals to undertake the work of administrating and managing the contracting process. They're able to become more competent and comfortable as they only have to learn a limited number of contract types and all of the rules and requirements that go with each of those contract types. It also saves time and money being spent drafting bespoke contracts for each individual construction project. On the slide, you can see a breakdown of contract usage within the construction industry based on the Construction Contracts and Law Survey from 2018. You'll see that the two most common forms of contract used are JCT and NEC, with NEC lagging a bit behind JCT. And you might be wondering why that is. And the simple answer is that whilst NEC even is endorsed by the Cabinet Office, JCT is still a perfectly valid and it's a good form of contract as well. And it just suits some organisations' requirements or the way that they want to manage the contracting process. So that's a very quick background to the NEC and an introduction to the NEC suite of contracts. We're now going to discuss the structure of the NEC3 contract. As I've mentioned earlier, the ethos behind the contract is an important element. The ethos provides or aims to improve construction project delivery, and through the improved management practice and the reduction of the number of disputes, and it's hoped through those improvements it will create a greater certainty of outcome throughout project delivery. And I mean, this is something that has been discussed and talked about for decades. I mean, as early as 1994, Sir Michael Latham recommended that NEC be adopted by both private and public sector clients and suggested that it become a national standard contract across engineering and construction works because of those aims and because of the embedded ethos within the contract. I mean, the NEC is considered a collaborative contract, and this is indicated in the very first clause within the contract, which emphasises that the organisations and people stated should work together. So it states in clause 10.1 that the employer, the contractor, the project manager and the supervisor shall act as stated in the contract and in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. Its prominence at the beginning of the contract is deliberate. It's there to emphasise the importance of these relationships in successful project delivery and the fact that those relationships are vital to good communication between the contracting parties. The NEC contract also provides additional options for partnering, which would allow you to bring in other organisations into the contract, such as a specialist subcontractor whose input could be essential for successful project delivery. The NEC contract is designed to be used as a tool, as I said, to improve management practice and avoid disputes. It's not meant to be stored away in case of problems. So the use of the contract should be foremost at the mind of the different parties throughout the life of the project. It contains a number of options which are designed to provide flexibility, and its wording allows it to be used across the construction industry and on civil engineering projects. The language as well is meant to be simple and clear, making it easy to understand, and it's intended to support good project management practices. It puts in place processes for both the project manager and the contractor to follow, for example, around how to agree changes to the works and how to work together collaboratively to react to issues which arise whilst on site, and that would be through the early warning process. It's a family of different documents. You can see on the slide there's the list of the different contracts that comprise the NEC suite of contracts, and the different contracts are there to cover the different kinds of relationships that we might enter into for a construction contract. So you have the ECC, which we're talking about today, with 6 main options, A to F, which provide different mechanisms and different options for how the risk is shared and how payments are made, and it's something that we'll cover in more detail later. There are also contracts to manage subcontractors, enabling back-to-back terms and conditions down the supply chain. There are shorter versions of the contract for small or simple projects, and there are also arrangements for engaging professional services, for example, architects, quantity surveyors, and so on. Each contract comes with a set of guidance notes and flowcharts to help project managers and contractors to understand the contract's requirements and also their role in delivering a successful project. So as mentioned sort of earlier, the NEC is ultimately a legal document. However, it has been prepared to be easy to understand and easy to read. So it does use a lot of plain English, so it avoids the use of woolly words and phrases such as "to the reasonable satisfaction of" or "in the opinion of." So that is designed in order to give some clarity to what the contract is intending. It uses the present tense, which underlines that it's meant to be used as a working document and not just sort of sat on the shelf until a problem arises. It has a simple structure, that all the documents in the family have the same structure. It uses short sentences and bullet points, again, to really emphasize that sort of use of plain English. Its procedures, which are not open-ended or conflicting, so there's flowcharts that sort of explain how to basically navigate through those procedures, and there's no cross-referencing. So there's no phrases such as subject to or notwithstanding. This means that the document needs to be understood as a whole. There are some standard conventions, and specifically relating to clause numbering. So, for example, general clauses start with number 1, clauses starting with a 5 are to do with payment, and so on. There are defined terms, which are words and phrases that begin with an initial capital letter, and there's a couple examples there on the slide of defined terms, so the site, working areas, a defect, plant and materials. There are identified terms, and these are words and phrases which are shown in italics in the contract, and these are terms which are project specific and are defined or identified in the contract data. An example of how these sort of terms and phrases appear in the contract is in clause 31.2, where you see that key date and completion date are defined and have a capital letter at the start. However, the starting date is listed in italics, and this would be inserted into the contract data. It's worth noting that a completion date is a defined term and an identified term, and this is because the completion date can be specified in the contract data, or it can be is an optional statement, or it can be left out of the contract data, at which point it then just reverts back to being a defined term. And that could be done in a situation where time is not a critical factor to the employer, and therefore feels that by not setting a completion date, they can give the contractor more flexibility to deliver the project through creative or innovative delivery solutions, and therefore offer a better product or cheaper delivery. So some examples of some key terms and phrases that we'll be going through today. We have the works information. This is what the contractor has to do in order to complete the works. In NEC4, this has been renamed as scope, which I feel is a little clearer, and it brings it in line with the other contracts in the NEC suite. We have the site information, and this tells the contractor about the site they're working on and what the contractor is expected to have allowed for within their price. So, for example, site information could contain the ground investigation reports or a drawing showing where the utilities are buried. The contractor is the main contractor for delivering the works. The employer is the person or organisation that is paying for the works. The project manager is the employer's representative on the project, and it's someone who should be authorised to a sufficient level to be able to undertake the role as identified within the NEC contract. There's also a supervisor, and this is the person who oversees the work undertaken by the contractor, and they certify that the work is being carried out in accordance with the contract. We have early warnings. This is a notification which is sent by either the project manager or the contractor to the other to warn of a potential event. There is change to the works information, which is commonly called a PMI or project manager's instruction. This is a notification sent by the PM to the contractor changing something in the works information, such as changing the colour of the carpet in an office being built. The fee is the amount calculated by applying the contractor's fee percentages to the defined cost, and that's the value of work payable by the employer to date. The site is the area within the boundaries of the site, and the site is basically the location where the work is going to be carried out, and it's defined by the site boundaries. We have accepted program, and this is the program which is being accepted, or the latest version of the program that has been accepted by the project manager, and it supersedes previous versions of the program. So that emphasizes the fact that the program is a living document that basically needs to be managed and kept up to date as the contract progresses. You have completion, which is when the contractor has done all of the works within the works information, and it's all of the works that have to be done by the completion date, and that includes the correction of notified defects, which would prevent the employer from basically taking ownership of the completed building or the completed works. You have a change to the works information, which is a revision of the works information, which is issued by the project manager and alters the work which the contractor needs to do in order to achieve completion. And finally, you have compensation event, and there's a list of events in clause 6, and it's basically, if they occur, it means that the time and cost due to the contractor for the project can change. An example would be a change to the works information. There are several terms that we're probably familiar with which aren't used in the ECC, so there's some examples there on time, so you don't have things like variations, delay and disruption, architect or QS. They're all terms I think that we may well have utilised or know of from other forms of contract, and other than the last item, they are generally considered slightly confrontational terms, and they're often utilised, or they get brought up more at the end of projects if they've not gone particularly well. So it's why the NEC tries to avoid using those terms. Just a quick clarification on the project manager. It's worth noting that on any construction project, there's a plethora of project managers. The client may well have a project manager who's responsible for obtaining funding. There can be a client project manager who deals with various stakeholders linked to the project. The contractor may well have a project manager on site or operating from their office, and even subcontractors might bring a project manager to the job. Adding to this, the NEC contract has a key role of the project manager, and it's this key role that we're talking about today when we say project manager. So onto the contract itself. The contract contains contract date as part 1 and 2. and these are in addition to the core clauses of the contract. And this stems from basic contract law, that a contract is made up by one party stating that they want something and the second party making an offer to provide that thing that the first party wants. So as such, part 1 is completed by the employer and it identifies their requirements, and part 2 contains the information submitted by the contractor as part of their tender or offer to undertake the works. Here's an example of contract data part 1 from a scheme delivered by East Riding of Yorkshire Council a few years ago, and it just to show you what it looks like. It covers things like the options that have been selected for the contract, who the employer is, who the project manager is, and in addition to what can be seen on the screen, contract data part 1 also covers things like what delay damages are being applied and what the start date is and so on. And this is an example of what contract data 2 looks like, part 2 looks like. And this is the template completed by the contractor, and the contractor is basically detailing information such as who their key people are, what the fee percentages are, and further on there's things like the total prices for the work, so it contains their offer for undertaking the contract. So that's a bit of a sort of summary. So you've got the core clauses, which are common to all of the main options. You've got the contract data part 1 and part 2, but in addition to that, the NEC is also a bit like a shopping list, where you, in addition to those core clauses which are in every contract, you can then select one of several main options, which are A to F, and then you can have as many or as few of the secondary options as you like, and it's basically a bit of a pick and mix approach there. So we'll just go on to and look at the main options in a bit more detail first. So we've got options A to F, and you'll see that option A and B are priced contracts. So that basically means they are a fixed cost contract. Option A has an activity schedule, and option B is based on a bill of quantities. So an activity schedule is just basically a list of the different activities that need to be completed by the contractor to complete the works, and the contractor would price each activity, and a bill of quantities is basically a list of different items and their quantities, which are then priced, and that would be everything that needed to be done in order to complete the works. You then have options C and D, which are target contracts, and these operate slightly differently in that they set effectively a target cost, and then the contractor basically works up to the target, and then there is some mechanisms for if you come in under or over the target cost, which we'll go through in a little bit. And then you have option E, which is a cost reimbursable contract, which basically it's a little bit like a blank check, but with some checks and balances in order to protect the employer's interest. And then you have option F, which is a management contract. The most commonly used contracts are A and C, which are based on the activity schedule. So once you've picked your main contract option, there are then a number of secondary options which are available, and this is kind of the pick and mix part. I'm not going to go through all of them because there's an awful lot there, so I'm just going to highlight a few. You'll probably note X2, change in law, which has been quite prevalent with changes due to Brexit and things like that. Basically, it determines which party takes the responsibility or the risk of changes in legislation. There's price adjustment for inflation, which is X1, which has been a bit prevalent with some of the materials shortages and supply issues that we've been experiencing recently. So you might find that that's starting to appear in your contracts or being asked for by contractors when they're bidding for works. We also have X5, which is sectional completion, and you would use this where the project has several defined sections that will complete at different times. For example, you might have a contract for the refurbishment of several car parks in different locations, so you basically issue each one as a section, and therefore once each car park is completed, it can be released back to the employer and they can make gainful use of that asset. You have X7, which allows you to assign the amount of delayed damages that the contractor has to pay should they not complete the works by the completion date. There's X12, which I mentioned before about partnering, which allows you to engage multiple organisations within the contract. So you might use this where you have a specialist subcontractor that you're relying on or is critical to the delivery of the project. And you have X15, which limits the contractor's design liability. The default design liability under NEC is that the design work is undertaken by the contractor is fit for purpose. Contractors often have an issue with this as it's above the typical obligation expected in the industry. So X15 limits the contractor to needing to use reasonable skill and care to ensure that the design complies with the works information. To better explain this, without X15, if an employer let a contract asking for the contractor to design and construct a specialist education needs school, there could be all sorts of specialist equipment that the employer could argue the contractor should have allowed for in their price that was possibly never mentioned in the works information. However, the same project with X15 included would limit the contractor's responsibility to meeting the requirements of the works information. There's 4 clauses on there that are in blue, and it's worth noting that they're not in the ECC. So it's just worth noting that they do exist, but they're not in this particular contract. So that's a brief overview of the NEC structure. I'm now going to hand you back to Mike to talk about the main features.
Okay, yeah, that's grand. Thanks for that, Phil. So yeah, the following slides we've got here really sort of focus, as we've kind of been saying already, about the NEC3 ECC or Engineering and Construction Contract 2013 with main option A. Now we have kind of throughout the presentation we have given a few kind of points as to where there is some differences between the options just to kind of help broaden the understanding. But this is understood to be the most widely used of the contracts, which is why we've gone with this one today. So in terms of project management or contract administrations, might be termed under other contracts. So the contract includes roles for a PM to manage and administer the contract, and the supervisor to check the work is carried out in accordance with the works information. So you may well imagine these as being a supervisor being a clerk of works. It's not exactly the same role as a clerk of works under other contracts. There is more duty upon a supervisor. Equally, a project manager, this role is, it may be carried out within your organisations by a QS, it may be by a specific project manager, it may be by a building surveyor. But there is certain sort of duties upon that project manager, and there's a certain amount of authority the project manager needs to have in order to undertake the contract accordingly. So one of the kind of things to highlight just in terms of NEC, particularly if you're used to a different form of contract, is do be prepared for more sort of administration during the project. So I mean I'm currently delivering a £9 million new build office block. Now I'll be our colleague Katie's working with us today. Katie's doing a lot of the work for me, to be totally honest, in terms of preparing some of the paperwork and supporting me in getting the administration of the contract done. Very much depends on the size of your project as to how much input you need to have, but it is important to kind of to say under NEC you have to put the time into the paperwork and making sure you work to the contract throughout the life of the scheme. The good side to that is when you get to the completion of it, your work should be done, but do be prepared to put the effort in during the scheme as well. And just to kind of to highlight the difference between sort of for example a JCT and NEC. Under JCT, you will have a list of contract conditions. Entirely separate to that, a project manager or whoever you've got running as a contract administrator will no doubt have their own procedures for administering a project. With NEC, they've tried to combine that into the single document, so it gives this contractualized project management, and it's really good, I find, as being a bit of a trigger for the PM to make sure that they're sticking to timescales, that they're doing what they should be doing to deliver a scheme successfully. I've seen that we've got a question about qualities and skills, and we'll pick that up in a little bit. But you know, it's important to say that it is important that the PM has appropriate qualities, project management skills, and understanding of NEC contracts to not only proactively manage the contract, but it is about fostering that collaborative working with the contractor. It does come down to personalities, and you know, there's no piece of paper in the world that will stop someone, you know, trying to frustrate another party if that's what they're really hell bent on doing. But by following the NEC and coming to it with a proactive, positive approach, you know, you should sort of hopefully result in a successful project, and certainly a project which is easier for both, you know, the PM and the contractor to work together on. I'll touch a little bit in terms of design. Phil's already mentioned about X15 and how that's used to reduce the design liability for contractors. If you know, if the choice is to do that, I think, you know, it's important to highlight in terms of why do we have all these main options and why do we have all these secondary options. It's so that we can decide how to allocate the risk on the scheme. So it may well be there's a particular reason why an employer doesn't want to include X15, and the contractor tendering for that project needs to be aware of that and have made due allowance for it. But the NEC contract is great in that it basically, you can just state in the contract what areas of the works you want the contractor to design. It can be fully in-house design, it can be fully contracted design, or a hybrid. You just need to make sure that you draft the works information accordingly. Now, construction work is risky, you know, obviously in the sense of health and safety, but also in terms of cost and delay. You know, you're doing expensive work with a lot of different people spending time on the project. Materials are expensive, and you know, as Phil's alluded to, getting more expensive and harder to get a hold of. And you're often working with things that you don't exactly know the content of until you get on site. You know, just to take an example, if you was, you know, working on refurbishing a car park, for example, you can have every record under the sun of that car park, but you won't know absolutely for certain what is under the surface of a car park until you dig it up. So a job, you know, taking a car park as an example, you know, that job could be impacted, for example, unexpected pipework from services. I recall, you know, a number of years back, one of my colleagues who was doing work resurfacing a road, and they dug up the road and clipped some kind of pipe which wasn't on any utility services, not on any utility records. It started kind of oil kind of started sort of coming out of this pipe, and they were all stood around wondering what this pipe was. And then a lorry sort of parked up, and a load of soldiers with automatic rifles jumped out, herded the contractor away from the hole and guided the hole, which turned out to be some kind of a MOD early warning system that we clipped. So yeah, there's all kinds of unforeseens that can happen when you're undertaking construction. So to try and address this, early warnings are a key proactive management tool available to both the PM and the contractor within the NEC form of contract, and it mandates that both the PM and the contractor have to highlight to each other any issues that they think have the potential to increase the prices, delay completion, or meet a key date, or impair the performance of the works in use. And to kind of to go into the risk management. So this is an example of a risk register used within NEC. So as you can see on screen, it details what the risk is, what action is to be taken by who and when. It's not a massively complicated document, but it's a key document to try and keep track of those key risks and what we're going to do. Now, I should highlight that because the term risk register can mean other things. I mean, to me, a project risk register is something that's held by the employer to track contingencies for a project separate to the works. In NEC4, the risk register is actually renamed as the early warning register, which I think is a positive approach. And even on my NEC3 jobs, I tend to refer to it as an early warning register just because everyone's more comfortable with that term. What we're going to do now is just look at two examples of early warnings and how they could be handled. What we're going to look at is, I think we're looking at COVID and material shortages. I'm going to go a little bit geeky in the contract here because I know there's a lot of talk about how these issues are handled within the contract. So looking at scenario A then. So scenario A, COVID. So the contractor raises an early warning to the PM stating the current social distancing restrictions relating to COVID-19 have the potential to restrict the ability for workers to attend site due to illness or due to shielding requirements. for suppliers to be able to supply materials, and means additional cost will be incurred due to the need for social distancing on site. And they ask for a risk reduction meeting to be held. So what happens under the contract is a risk reduction meeting is held between the PM and the contractor, discussing the issue and coming up with measures to avoid or reduce the risks stated by the contractor. Following that meeting, the PM then updates the risk register to record the decisions made and issues this to the contractor. And if there are any changes to the working information, the PM also instructs these changes along with issuing the risk register. As to what the decisions are going to be and whether COVID will incur additional costs to the employer or the contractor depends very much on the nature of the project and when the contractor submitted their tender for the works and when the early warning was issued. I mean, my personal view, which is only hypothetical and individual contracts may well directly contradict this, is that unless the contract was signed before the first lockdown happened back in March 2020, the contractor knew at least there will be some likely impact of COVID-19. And as time's gone on, more details have become more obvious. You know, for example, it's not unreasonable, in my view, for the PM to expect the contractor to have allowed for working in line with whatever version of the Construction Leadership Council's guidance on COVID-19 was available at that time. That's not to say that that there won't definitely be any kind of cost to the employer. You know, for example, as Phil mentioned about X2 changes in law, if that's in place and the UK government puts in place a new regulation restricting travel around the country or restricting supply of materials, then again, that could be used as a reason for claiming. So yeah, that we'll go. That's enough in terms of COVID. We can go a lot into it, but that will do for that one. In terms of material shortage, so taking this example, so again, so the contractor warns of potential impact due to material shortages. So the process is exactly the same as described. So the contractor or the PM raises an early warning. There's a risk reduction meeting if the parties feel there needs to be one. And any decisions made are recorded in the risk register. Now, again, what decisions will be, you know, in my personal view, it's a difficult one. You know, some material shortages should always be anticipated on any construction project. You know, a competent contractor should be placing their orders in plenty of time to make sure they get the materials to site. Any kind of impacts in terms of COVID, Brexit, the Suez Canal blockage, they should all be well aware of those things. However, nevertheless, we are seeing, you know, extraordinary issues in terms of material supply in some areas of the industry, which may be sort of exceptional material delays, which could result in the compensation event, you know, beyond what would be reasonable to foresee. But putting claims to one side, the risk reduction meeting, you know, it may well result in decisions made to search for alternative products to try and to source instead of the ones that have been specified. It's important to remember that the point of the early warning process and the risk reduction meeting is to find solutions. It's not intended as a way of moving risk from one party to the other, or as a way of like putting together an argument for a compensation event. It's trying to find a solution. So the contract allows both parties to highlight and manage risk, and the risk register referred to can have risks added to it right at the start of the contract by the employer, and the contractor can also add risks in when they complete their contract data. Again, important to say, the point of including the risks in the risk register is to have a list of issues to talk about. It's not trying to move risk from one party to the other. The employer can also add employees' risks in the contract data. Now, there's a standard set of risks under the contract which are employees' risks. For example, the risk of war disrupting the works is borne by the employer, but these can be added to. Now, it's important to be careful in listing employees' risks because they can actually have quite far-reaching effects. And so, for example, if the employer takes on the risk of the site flooding, they're actually also indemnifying the contractor against the cost of damage to third parties. So, for example, temporary equipment being washed away. In this situation, the employer might actually be better off listing an additional compensation event for flooding over a certain level as a Z clause within the contract, because that would only protect the contractor against the time and cost effects of the compensation event. So that was all we're going to go through at this point. Now we are a little bit ahead of time in terms of the break, so I'm just going to drop onto the questions. I think we've had last time I checked, we just had one question come through. Actually, we've got 3 now, so let's tackle these. So what would be the main reason for choosing main options A or B? They both seem necessary. I mean, yeah, I mean, they both have their own benefits. Actually, after the break, we are going to be touching, I think Phil's going to be touching a little bit in terms of the choice of an activity schedule or below quantities. So there is that. So we are going to touch upon that. So hopefully we'll tackle that one, Demi. But by all means, if you want a bit more detail after that, give us, drop another question, and we'll try and tackle it towards the end. One for Sir Justina, he's asked, how do you ensure the client side cost manager / QS and contractor team have the relevant experience and use it confidently from the start of the delivery stage? That's a really good question, and it's a real challenge, Justina, to be entirely honest. Obviously going to the training sessions like the one that we're delivering today will help give people an understanding of the NEC, but you're absolutely right that when the going gets tough, people tend to refer back to what they were what they used to. So you do. I've been in jobs where suddenly you start getting mentions of day work or remeasurement under an option A contract, which isn't a thing you need to do. It's not a remeasurement contract, because it's what they're familiar with. And I would also say that even experienced construction professionals, do they don't understand the contract as well as they might say they do. There's been time and time again where even as like a relatively experienced PM, on the first couple of jobs, you deal with contractors and you're going, well, actually what you're saying isn't right. It's not what the contract says. So it's a difficult one to give an answer to be honest, Justina. It's all I can really say is as a PM, you've got to try and do your best to set out quite clearly, look, this is what I think the contract says. If you disagree with that, then by all means you can come back to us and disagree and explain why you disagree. But they should behave as you want. Phil, I don't know if you've got any kind of suggestions on that.
I was just going to kind of jump in and sort of say, it's very much a case of, whereas Mike says that we can't guarantee, or there's nothing that you can do to force somebody to not let the project slip, to basically become more like a JCT. But it then comes back to that they're basically failing on clause 10.1, right back at the beginning of the contract, that they're not acting in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation, and they're also not undertaking their role as required in the contract. And whilst you can't force somebody to actually do it, there are time limits for things within the contract, and so by failing to do for certain actions, so by failing to do their role, either a project manager or contractors team could actually be leaving themselves vulnerable to sort of a claim for compensation event, or if they're not following the timescales and reacting proactively to compensation events, they could find that the contractor's price is basically accepted into the sort of, so you could find that you actually end up undermining your position, or exposing your employer to additional costs or risks. So you do have to remember that sticking to the contract is there for is there for the benefit of both parties. Also, if a contract did end up in adjudication and one party has not been following the contract and the other party has, the adjudication is going, or potentially going to be skewed in the favour of the party that has been trying to follow the contract. So again, it's that thing of, you could, by not following the contract, you are opening up new risks to the employer, or if the contract is not following it, the contract is exposing themselves to risks by not following the contract.
That's brilliant, thanks, Phil. And I see also a question about, is there an issue if the NEC PM is the one who raises all early warnings to be helpful under 10.1. Does this compromise clause to 61.5? It shouldn't do. I mean, I would expect both parties to raise early warnings at each other, and it's important to say that sometimes early warnings are seen as, and again, this kind of shows the maturity of an organisation in terms of NEC. If people see early warnings as an opportunity to hit the other party with a stick, then you're doing it wrong. That's not what an early warning is about. It's about highlighting something you've got a concern about and you want to get on the table and discuss. I mean, potentially there's an issue if the NEC PM is the one who raises all early warnings. As you say, under 61.5, for anyone who's not got the contract in front of them, it says if the PM decides that the contractor did not give an early warning of the event which an experienced contractor could have given, if he notifies this decision to the contractor when he notifies the decision to the contractor when he instructs him to submit quotations. Now, I think in reality, if the PM is raising all early warnings to be helpful, then I would say it's difficult for the PM to then, implement 61.5 to say, the contractor did not give an early warning. If you're saying, for example, if we take material supply, if you and the contractor are both aware that material supply is an issue, and the PM decides to raise it, I would say, well, the contractor wouldn't have needed to raise it because the PM already has. If the PM doesn't raise an early warning in material shortages, then I would expect the contractor to issue an early warning about it. It's what has triggered the PM to raising that early warning. Is it, for example, an email from the contractor to the PM saying, I think, I'm really concerned about material supplies, and then the PM, to do the formal paperwork, does an early warning. I don't think there's really anything there that you could use as in terms of affecting anything in terms of compensation events, and saying the contractor's not given us notice, because they have given you an email, or they haven't had, they've given you something that's been written down, and you can read that says, we're concerned about this. Interesting question though, and I think it is something that sometimes isn't quite picked up on, is that the contractor does expect you to have a contractor who's competent and experienced in delivering whatever the works are in question. That they shouldn't have tendered for the works if that wasn't the case. So yeah, there are some situations where there's nothing in the contract, but it's simply what you would expect in terms of industry guidance or sort of approved code of practice, that you can say, well, surely a competent contractor would have done X, Y, and Z. So it's not a compensation event, or the effect of a compensation event is lessened as a result.
Can I just jump in as well, just quickly? I mean, I'm going to keep banging the ethos drum, so you might get a bit sick of hearing this, but the point is that you're supposed to be working together collaboratively, so we shouldn't be trying to trip the other party up, or use things as a stick, as Mike was saying, for compensation event purposes, because at the end of the day, if you know that something is going to happen, or there's a strong likelihood that something could happen, and you leave it and wait for the contractor to raise it, you're basically eating into the time that the contractor would have to react to the event, plan for it, and actually kind of then minimize and mitigate the effect on the delivery of the project. Now, I mean, it's me and Mike are sort of, working in the public sector. One of the biggest things that we have is, sort of the appearance of project delays and overruns, and the members of the public wanting to see things being completed on time, to budget, and the rest of it. So if we're not doing our part to help the contractor deliver them, we are compromising the ability for the contractor to achieve those things, and also we're then going to make our own authority look bad, because there'll be all of our projects will overrun, they will come in over budget, because we've restricted the contractor's ability to be able to react to events. As Mike says, you won't have the same time frames to react to do your early your risk reduction meeting. You won't have the same time effects to be able to plan if there's a material shortage, do a quick design change and order something else that is available and get it to site on time, because you're doing all of that at the point at which the delivery, say, should have been there and now no longer is. So it is very much a case of trying to remember that, you know, to work collaboratively. So if you are aware of something, you should, you know, you can let the other party know, and hopefully if you're both doing that, you will have a much better and smoother project delivery. As Mike said earlier when he's talking about time and effort, you might find that the time and effort used at the various points while you're on site is a bit higher, but you should reap the reward at the end.
That's grand, thanks, Phil. Debbie, I've seen your comment about avoiding the terms, so the alternative terms used to address issues. So just kind of picking up on the examples that we posted. So extension of time, that becomes a change to the completion date under NEC. Variations is a change to works information. Claims is a compensation event. Delay and disruption, loss and expense become delay damages. So most of those, I think that the terms used in NEC are just a little bit less confrontational. You know, a claim versus a compensation event just sounds a little bit easy. You know, so some of it still isn't quite perfect. You know, in my view. I mean, for example, I've had issues on a job where the supervisor being criticised for raising too many defects when it's actually about a lack of design information. The contractors on the design and build job has to provide not only the works but also design information for the PM to review. So, but when that's been lacking, it's been raised as a defect. Contractually, that's absolutely right. In common working term, you might actually refer to that as it might be classed as a technical request for information. So I have seen some sort of use of the NEC where there's actually been a deliberate sort of Z clause or tweak to the contract to say we're going to use these additional terms. So a defect is when there's a physical problem with the works, and we'll use, for example, a technical request when it's some lacking information. It doesn't need to be done like that, but sometimes people do that to try and address to make the language as friendly as possible. In terms of Emma's question, so Emma's question is about the use of the JCT versus NEC. I mean, it's important to kind of highlight, certainly for myself, my experience is almost exclusively NEC, and I think actually for the thing that immediately springs to mind for me is it's partially a matter of training. People are naturally drawn to what they're comfortable using. I would be, I would, even myself, I would have a level of nervousness about taking on the JCT contract. JCT, you're obviously right, Emma, is heavily used within the industry. It's a perfectly acceptable form of contract. But if someone said to me, right, your next job, Mike, is going to be a JCT job, I would need to do a lot of reading about it. I would probably want to go on a training course like this just so that I was comfortable administering the contract. Phil, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think just to sort of add to that, I think a lot of it is comfort. Some of it's just down to, I think, as I've mentioned while I was talking through the slides, it's what an organisation is comfortable with, because JCT and NEC are both very good forms of contract. It's just that NEC is seen by some as being quite time intensive, and sort of the effort to manage it is seen as quite intense. But as we've said, typically that's about trying to spread that workload across the contract rather than leaving it all to the end and having a big argument about, did something have an impact or not? Whereas some authorities or clients kind of look at it and sort of go, well, over the course of a contract, there'll be some places where they gain, some where they lose. And what we can do is, if we leave it till the end, we can kind of use it as a bit of a tick and balance and come up with what the reasonable adjustment is, and they're comfortable doing it that way and taking it forward. I mean, I suppose it could be down to organizational culture, or as Mike says, what they're used to. I mean, the other thing as well is just to remember is that JCT was developed much earlier, so it has a greater history in the construction industry. So as Mike was saying about, you know, embedded processes or what people are comfortable with, people will generally have more experience of JCT. And I think Mike might correct me if I'm wrong, but JCT was designed by, was it RIBA or the architects? And traditionally, the architect would have undertaken the project manager's role. So the fact that, you know, it was designed by architects for them to use, you kind of have that sort of history of JCT being embedded in the construction industry as almost a sort of default form of contract. So there's a few things there. The usage doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It's, you know, they are both perfectly good. It's just how they allocate risk, how the contract management sort of or how the contract is managed and administered is different, and it works for some people. You know, JCT works better for some people, NEC works better for others. It's very much about finding what works best for your organisation, I would say, and then sort of tying to that.
That's brilliant. Okay, well, that's actually brought us spot on to 10:35, which is when we was planning to have a little break. So let's take 10 minutes now, guys, and we'll come back at 10:45, and then we'll carry on with the main features. Thanks all. Hi everyone. So I hope you've had a chance to refresh your cups and get ready for the rest of the session. Great to see a few questions before the break, which we hope we answered, certainly to our best of our ability. By all means, feel free to send more questions through, and we've got a nice big sort of time for Q&A at the end. So feel free to make full use of that. Just looking at moving into the rest of the main features then. So we're going to be looking particularly at the program now. I think for this next bit of the presentation, we're both going to be chipping in a fair bit as we work through. So in terms of program, so the beating heart of the NEC is the program, and it's probably, to be entirely honest, the most poorly understood bit of the contract. I mean, simply put, the accepted program is used to assess delays and extensions to the contract, and it's something, because it's maybe not common to other forms of contract, this level of involvement with the program. It is something that sometimes people are a little bit concerned about, but it's nothing to be scared of, but it does need to be tackled. It needs to be reviewed regularly. It needs to be accepted or not accepted by the project manager, so that everyone's clear on how the scheme is progressing, against the contract, and whether we're ahead of time, whether we're behind time, that kind of stuff. Now, there can be confusion between the three terms that we've got up at the top of this slide: completion, the completion date, and planned completion. Also, not unusually, even when delivering an NEC term, you'll hear people bandy around the term practical completion. This is not a term under NEC. It doesn't have the meaning of practical completion. Isn't a thing under NEC. So it's a really good habit to get into, to try and administer the program correctly and to use the right terms, because it will just make everyone's lives easier down the line. So the three terms then. So we have completion. So this is when the work's complete. The works can be, we imagine the works as being construction works. It could also be, for example, the provision of an O&M manual. It could be provision of training. It could be those kind of elements that need to be met as well to reach completion. Then in the program, the contractor shows progress against the completion date. This is a contractual date when completion should happen, and planned completion, which is when the contractor expects to achieve completion. So the completion date and planned completion will start off the same, but very rarely end the same. So that's kind of what you expect to see as the program kind of progresses. And we're going to be going into a few sort of examples of programs, and then Phil will go into some detail in terms of float. So firstly, looking at program. So up on screen, we've got an example of a simplified NEC program. This is a very, very simple program. If I was strictly assessing this as a project manager, I would probably say it doesn't quite include all the information that's needed within the program, but it's got the right terms, and I just want to put something up there so that people can get their heads around it. So as you can see, this is a program for building a house. So you've got a starting date for the start of the contract. You also got an access date, which we've put as the same as the starting date, but it could be after that. So if you had a contract which was to design and build something, you may well start the works, but actually access to the site might not be for 2 months after starting, because you're going to spend 2 months designing the scheme anyway. On our example house, then you've got foundation, superstructure, roof, and then you move internally doing your building services, your decoration, and finishing off with some training. And then once all of those activities are then complete, there's then planned completion and the completion date. As you can see, they're both currently exactly the same date. They're both down as the 19th of October. But what we'll look at is how these are affected over the life of the scheme. But basically, the program is reviewed and updated as the project progresses, and should take into account the effect of compensation events, e.g. events that affect the time and/or costs of the scheme. And it should also track the contractor's actual progress versus what they stated at the start of the contract, which is what this is. So we're going to go through just two examples of how the program can change. So in the first example, the superstructure activity has been extended. So in the original example, superstructure was down for 2 weeks. It's now been changed to 4 weeks, and the reason why it's changed from 2 to 4 weeks is because the contractor built the walls using the wrong bricks, and now they've had to take them down and rebuild them using the correct bricks. The effect of that, if you look down at activities 9 and 10 towards the bottom of the table, so planned completion has moved. So it was the 19th of October, it's now the 2nd of November. It's moved back 2 weeks. However, the completion date has not. That's the contractual date for completion. That's still the 19th of October. So what this means is that, therefore, if the contract delay includes delay damages, the contract is facing having to pay for 2 weeks of delay damages. So it shows that there's a delay there, and it's the contractor's fault effectively. And then kind of go into the second example. So this is the flip side. So this is showing how the program changes when a compensation event occurs. So in this example, the ground conditions on site are worse than expected, e.g. what was stated in the site information and what you would expect a competent contractor to allow for. As a result of that, the contractors had to pour the foundations a second time. This particular example I'm saying is a comp event because it's not the contractor's fault, and based on the information available to the contractor at tender, they wouldn't have known to allow for the actual ground conditions. So this is just this particular example. So what the contractor's done on here is that they've shown on the program the compensation event, here identified with a red rectangle around it. And you'll see down at the bottom activities 10 and 11 that they've both been moved. So both the plan completion date, sorry, the plan completion and the completion date have both moved back by 1 week. So they've moved from the 19th of October to the 26th of October. Note a couple of things. One, that the extra time is only equivalent to the impact that the compensation event has had upon the completion date. It shouldn't be an opportunity for the contractor to gain extra time. It's entirely possible we've got quite a simple program here. It's entirely possible for a compensation event to occur that doesn't affect the completion date because it's happened early enough in the scheme. It's not on the critical path. So it might have a cost impact. There might be more labour, plant materials, whatever is required to carry out that compensation event, but it's not an impact on time. So I think now I'll hand over to Phil, and he's going to go into a bit more detail, specifically in terms of float.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I've got some very basic examples, more basic than Mike has gone into. So they definitely are not compliant programs from an NEC perspective, but it's a case of just trying to keep things a little bit simple, so that way you can kind of see the effect that either compensation events or contracted delay can have on activities when they're not on the critical path. So what we've got here is a very basic example of a project with two sort of sets of tasks running parallel to each other. So we've got operations 1, 2 and 3 at the top, which are on the critical path and identified in red, and then you've got operations 4 and 5, which are being done concurrently but are off the critical path. And on this initial program, the contractor is basically going to start operation 4 as early as possible in order to allow for 2 weeks of float at the end. And there you have the 2 weeks identified before planned completion and completion date. And as in Mike's example, those two dates are starting off the same. Planned completion and completion date are the same at the end of week 7. So what we have next is CE1 is issued by the employer, and so that gets added to the program, as you can see just beneath operation 3. This particular item is happening off the critical path, but it needs to be completed before operation 4 can start, and therefore before operation 5 can start. So the effect is that CE1 moves back the start for operation 4 and operation 5 by 1 week. And what this does is it reduces the float available at the end, because it's worth noting that clause 63.3 identifies that a delay to the completion date is assessed as the length of time that due to a compensation event, planned completion is later than planned completion as shown on the latest accepted program. So because the employer has effectively got in first, they've put CE1 in before, and they have made use of one of the 2 weeks of float, because that impact of doing CE1, for all it has moved operation 4 and operation 5, it is not affecting the planned completion date. There's still a week's worth of float there, and because there's no effect on planned completion, the contractual completion date doesn't move either. And this works the same in the second example, which is based on a contractor delay. So alternatively, instead of a CE being issued, the contractor might decide, you know what, I'm not going to start at operation 4 in week 1 as I had planned. It could be due to weather, or it could be any number of reasons why they decide not to start on week 1. They're going to start on week 3 instead. So they're basically using their 2 weeks of float to decide how best to deliver the project, I suppose is the best way to describe it. And they, for all operations 4 and 5 are now going to start later than on the initial program. They are still going to be completed before the planned completion date. And therefore again, because there's no impact on planned completion or anything, there's still no change to the completion date there. I suppose this is just basically, like I say, the contractor choosing how to use their float and how best to deliver the project. But what happens if both occur? What happens if CE1 occurs and a contractor delay occurs? So if we go back to the first example where the CE has already occurred and happened first, so CE1 is already implemented and operation 4 has already been moved back to week 2, and there is now only 1 week of float remaining, the impact of a contractor delay of 2 weeks is shown as it would basically move operation 4 to start out at week 4. And as mentioned earlier, a delay to the completion date is assessed as the length of time that due to a compensation event that planned completion is later than planned completion shown on the accepted program. Because we've already looked at the impact of compensation event number 1 and it had no impact on planned completion, there is only 1 week of float. Once we're now looking at the effect of the contracted delay on this, it does move, which because it's 2 weeks again, it does move planned completion, but it's the contractor's delay that is affecting planned completion. So what that means is that whilst planned completion moves, the completion date will remain the same. So in this instance, as Mike alluded to on one of his previous examples, the contractor would then potentially be into delay damages because planned completion is moved as a result of their delay or their decision on how to deliver the project. Now, if it was to happen the other way round, so say the contractor delay occurred first and they basically moved operations 4 and 5 to the end, so they effectively become sort of tangential to the critical path, and then you try to add in compensation event 1, the contractor in this scenario has already claimed the float. So when you come to assess the effect of CE1, it has to start at week 3. That then pushes operation 4 back 1 week. So it's the compensation event that is moving the events back. The end result of that is that for all there was float on the original program, the contractor has used the float first. And that's, I suppose, the key thing that I'm trying to get across is that float is effectively owned by the party that gets there first, or free float as it's sometimes called, is known as is owned by the party that gets there first. So in this case, contractor gets in first. CE1 is then issued by the employer. The CE is the thing that alters the planned completion date, and so the completion date moves with planned completion. So in this scenario, the contractor would also be eligible to a 1 week extension on as part of the compensation event, and delay damages would not be applied. So that is a very quick explanation of float and some of the basics around how the float is used. But what it does emphasize is that is what Mike was saying about the program being an important contractual document, and why managing the program is so important. It's often, as Mike said, a little bit misunderstood, and therefore there can be some hesitation about tackling it, and this can cause problems down the line. But it's really important that the contractor keeps the program up to date, and that the PM accepts or does not accept the program in line with the timescales. So that way, when it comes to assessing the impact of compensation events, you are working off an accurate reflection of what is there on site. Because if, for example, a contractor fails to keep the program up to date and they are basically running behind, but then the employer issues CEs, as we saw, the employer would get in first, they would use the float, and then the contractor is effectively later down the line going to be the one that pays for that because of the delay is then being added second. The float is being claimed by the employer, and the contractor could end up paying delay damages. So if the contractor does keep the program up to date, it can help to protect them by allowing them to use the float, and basically kind of it would then mean that the impact of the CEs are assessed off their actual progress, and that could result in changes to the completion date. So that is everything about managing the program. I believe I'll just hand you back to Mike now, who's going to talk about sort of completion and quality defects.
Thanks, Phil. So yeah, I mean, completion, the definition of completion is as per the slide. And it's quite important, I feel, to understand the definition of defect. So completion is when the contractor has done everything the works information stated they are to do by the completion date, and fixed notified defects which would have prevented the employer from using the works and others from doing their work. So it's not necessarily 0 defects at completion, although you may tweak your contract if that's something that you specifically want. But it's that the contractor has completed the works, and any defects that basically prevent the use of whatever's been built has been sorted. So minor defects can still exist at completion. So it might be, if you've got a storeroom which has got a little bit of cracking in the plaster, or maybe a little bit of painting needs touching up, those things, they wouldn't prevent the employer from using what you've constructed. So you can still achieve completion with those outstanding defects. And what completion can be customized. So if you have a project that has external funding, for example, I think at the moment there's government funding available for electric car charging points and associated parking bays, but that funding requires evidence to be provided, like cost breakdowns and invoices. You could require that the contractor provides these things in order to reach completion. And then post-completion, there's a defects period, which is specified by the employer, during which the contractor has to correct defects within a specified defect correction period. Now, that's not something that is found in other contracts, such as JCT, and it is kind of important to note that the responsibility for defects sits with the supervisor rather than the PM. However, the reality is, you will have a new building which has got end users moved into that building, and they will be wanting a point of contact to report defects to. More often than not, in reality, that's the project manager, because they're the one who has known that building throughout the life of its construction, and they'll have access to the O&M manuals, presumably. So there's often involvement from the PM, certainly for the defects period, which is typically 1 year after completion. Now, sometimes you get a defect that actually you're happy to accept. An example could be a wall that's been painted in the wrong colour, but it's maybe it's maybe in the storeroom, or maybe a client's come around and said actually they quite like the look of that colour on that wall. Or it could be a electric socket that's been missed from a drawing, but the employer's quite happy to manage without. And the contract basically allows for this to happen, subject to both parties agreeing to consider accepting the defect. So you can't force a contractor to accept a defect. It might be that the contractor says, no, I want to fix it and make it as per the works information, and you can't make the PM accept something that's defective either. But if both parties are prepared to consider it, then there is a process there in terms of achieving that, which, you know, again, it's a good sort of collaborative mechanism to help sometimes get a scheme moving without being overly picky about every single last detail. And I think Phil's going to touch a little bit now in terms of the pricing, how the different main options operate, particularly in terms of like activity schedules, bills of quants and the like.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So, I mean, we've touched on this earlier in the presentation, where I gave a very brief overview of the different main options that are available under the ECC. So we've got them up there listed again. So you've got options A to F. So I'm just going to go into them with a little bit more detail now, and hopefully this will address or help answer Demi's question earlier about activity schedules and bills of quantities. So in terms of options A and B, they are priced contracts. They are lump sum contracts, or sometimes known as fixed price contracts. Option A is based on an activity schedule, and option B is on a bill of quantities. The difference is that an activity schedule is basically a list of tasks which have been identified by the employer and they're listed out in the activity schedule. And it's basically the things that need to be completed in order to complete the works. So this is basically the employer saying, I want you to tell me how much each of these activities will cost. A contractor, when they bid, can choose to subdivide those activities down further if they wish to, but it's still based on individual activities. And the main thing to note is that when you're using an activity schedule in NEC, the contractor is paid for completion of an activity. So a contractor is better off breaking things down into smaller chunks. Otherwise, it could affect their cash flow, because if they leave things, going back to Mike's very basic example of building a house, if they just have an activity for doing the foundations, another for building the walls, another for the roof, and another for the windows, it's only once each of those things are complete that they would be eligible to be paid for the activities. If they split them down and even further into smaller tasks, so they could have, instead of completing the foundations, that they have digging the trenching, pouring the concrete founds, then starting the brickwork foundations up, they could actually split that and ensure smoother cash flow to their business for the different tasks that have been completed. I mean, a bill of quantities is basically, as you'd expect, that it's a document containing detailed statements of works, prices, and dimensions, and other details, and that's basically the information that's required to complete the works. But the contractor there is basically pricing the quantities rather than a lump for an activity. And basically, as for A and B, as items of work are completed, let's say the employer will pay the contractor for the amount that has been done, to basically at the assessment period, which is typically once a month for sort of construction contracts. It's worth remembering that these documents, so an activity schedule or bill of quantities, they are payment documents effectively, so they don't form part of the works information. So it's worth remembering that, because there is sometimes a little bit of confusion and people try to incorporate them into the works information or try to make claims if there's changes made to those documents throughout the life of the project. In terms of option C and D, they are target contracts. So these set a target price for the contract, and the employer would then pay the actual defined cost up to the target. So it's basically they are paying the contractor for the actual cost of the work that has taken place to that assessment point. But the difference is, and it's a concept that may be new to you, is that on NEC, these two options include a pay and gain share mechanism, which I believe is in clause 53, or clause 53 may set the contractor's share. This is, and basically the pain and gain comes in is that it's the difference between the actual cost incurred by the contractor for delivering the works and the target cost. So if there is gain, then it means that the contractor has come in under the target cost, and if there's pain, the contractor has come in over the target contract cost. And the idea is that by setting a gain and pay, or pain and gain share, is that it's splitting either the gain. So basically, say the contract had a target cost of £1 million and the contractor actually only spends 900,000 building it, there was £100,000 gain, and then you would basically split that between the employer and the contractor. So it gives both parties an incentive to try and come in and work together to come in under the target, so that way they can basically share the gain. And for the contractor, it means increased profit. For the employer, it would mean a reduced cost of building. If there's pain, so if the contractor comes in over, so it's say it costs 1.1 million, then you could in theory have the same mechanism, and that would be a mechanism for sharing the risk effectively of going over the target. Now it could be 50-50, it could be 90-10, it can be whatever split that you feel is right. You can have different splits for different percentages. So say you could have a split where it's 50-50 for the first 5%, and then after that the split starts to skew towards the employer. It depends how you want to share that gain or spread that risk. It's also not uncommon to see a pay share where it is 100% to the contractor, but a gain share where there is an employer split. So sometimes, you know, an employer will want to take some of the gain but none of the pain. Like I say, it's not uncommon, but it depends how the employer wants to spread the risk on that particular project. There's option E, which I've sort of briefly mentioned before, which is cost reimbursable. It tends to only be used, or certainly in the public sector would only be used in a case of urgency. For example, where you know, as a result of flooding, say there's damage to a bridge or something like that, or there's an unsafe or unstable structure, you would potentially use a cost reimbursable contract to get a contractor on site quickly to do some remedial works in order to shore that structure up to stop it collapsing. And you basically are agreeing and working out the cost as you go, or, you know, having to do that, react quickly to an event, which would prevent you from using one of the other options. And then you have a management contract, which I don't believe I've ever actually seen used in 10 years, but there is that option there, which kind of sets out some different terms for how you could engage a party to help manage the NEC. It's worth noting as well that the NEC does not include for provisional sums, and most of you will probably see them because a lot of employers include Z clauses that allow the inclusion of provisional sums. But in theory, under the NEC, if it's left unamended, things like that would just come out through the compensation event procedure and be dealt with as sort of changes to the works information or project manager instructions. Typically we tend to see that they're used, certainly from a local authority perspective, because by including the provisional sums, it allows us to include or basically identify, as Mike said, sort of contingencies or risk pots, or have basically when we gain the authorization to proceed with the project, that we can include those values that we can then draw on later to cover the cost of sort of client changes or maybe design items where it's not fully set when we've undertaken the tender. In terms of the contract structure, as I say, the different contracts alter the financial risk, which is sort of what I was talking about in terms of the pain and gain share percentage. But you'll see we've put on the slide how basically as you move sort of down alphabetically, the financial risk moves away from the contractor to the employer. So option A, because it's based on an activity schedule, it's fixed prices. Basically, the contractor is taking a lot of the risks on the delivery of those items. It's basically up to the contractor to allow for that risk when pricing the activities. The same with option B, but because it's off a bill of quantities, there are some changes around how assumed quantities are kind of dealt with. So when the initial contract's let, there will be assumed quantities. So if they're not quite right, there is some employer risk there in terms of changing those. And then, like it says, you move through option C and D, because of the target cost and the pain and gain share, you are effectively splitting that that risk a little bit more. And what we do tend to find is that option C and D, a lot of employers do shy away from pain and gain share and using a target contract because they want to feel like they have cost certainty, and there's always a fear of it because if you go into a tendering process, a competitive tendering process, the target is basically set by the contractor and the prices that come back. And sometimes people have a fear that a contractor will try to pad the target cost as high as they can in order to effectively, you know, gain themselves an extra profit margin whilst appearing to share some of the pain, some of the gain even after completion. But I think each contract option has its merits, and it depends upon the nature of the project and the risk profile as to which contract option is actually best. So I wouldn't let fear or anything like that kind of dissuade you from a particular contract option, because some people do just default back to option A and so go, I want to push all of the risk to the contractor, and that's not necessarily the way to gain the best value for money for the employer or through the contract delivery. I'm just going to touch on a question quickly here because it's sort of relevant, and Sam sort of asked about if a contractor says 20% of the substructure in option A, option C, in terms of if they basically split the activity down like that into different percentage chunks. They can do that, but it goes kind of against the contract itself, because you're introducing subjectivity around, well, what is considered 20%? You know, how far through is it? If you say substructure, as I say, you tend to have like different activities of trenching, of pouring the concrete and starting to build the blockwork up. Would you say digging the trenching is 20%? Or, you know, at what point do you hit that? So whilst contractors might do it, I would be hesitant to accept it, because it's adding in some subjectivity. So it might be something that you would want to go back to the contractor and ask them to clarify if your tendering rules allow that sort of clarification after the tenders have been received. I think Mike just maybe wants to jump in quickly.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point. It just depends exactly on how they've defined it. If they've put in their activity schedule, you know, 20% substructure complete, 40% complete, 60% complete, they can do that. But as Phil says, there's issues in terms of how was that actually measured. If, however, they've just put an activity of substructure, then they can't do that. They would need to, with the agreement, effectively revise the activity schedule to break it down into further activities. So it just depends how the current activity schedule is defined as to whether they can claim it or not.
Perfect, thanks Mike. That hands me on nicely to the next slide, which is about payment. So which is, I think, sort of quickly touched on this before, but option A, activity schedule, the item needs to be 100% complete. So as Mike was saying, is that if the contractor hasn't broken down the activity into smaller sub activities, they will not get paid for 20% or 40% or any breakdown. They will only receive payment once the activity is fully completed. So it's worth, as I was saying, making sure that the activities are broken out sufficiently at tender stage, or as Mike did sort of allude to, you can vary the activity schedule by agreement, but you need to be a little bit wary about entering into those agreements that you're not sort of distorting anything or reapportioning risk, because the activity schedule is intrinsically linked to the program. And so what you need to make sure is that they don't say front load it by breaking out the price of an activity that say comprises 4 or 5 individual tasks on the program, but say items 1 to 4 completed in the first 4 weeks and item 5 is a 4-week task. If you allow them to break it out, you need to make sure that they don't effectively front load their payment, which they wouldn't have been able to do before. So it's just making sure that these things are dealt with correctly or properly at the time at the beginning of the contract is always better. You've got option B, which is bill of quantities. So you've got payment is based on a remeasure plus a proportion of lump sums. So as I was sort of saying before, because it's based off quantities, if you've got the substructure, that one would be based on, say, the amount of materials that have been used to get to that point, and a proportion of any lump sums that have also linked to that particular item that is being delivered off the bill of quantities. And then you have option C to F, where payment is based upon the forecast of defined cost that is to be paid before the next assessment event. So you're always paying 1 month in advance for the activity that is being undertaken. And there is a bit of a revision because you're basing on the forecast for next month. You have to revise the previous forecast to bring it in line with what has actually been achieved to date. So say a contractor forecasts that they'll spend £100,000 in the first month. When you get to the end of the first month, if they've only spent 90, you then would look at what are they going to spend in month 2, less the £10,000 that they've not actually spent to that month, or if they'd spent more, you would have to adjust it upwards. So it can be a little more complicated, but the main thing to remember is that you're paying the contractor for defined cost, which is the work that they've actually done. So you're basically paying actual costs plus their NEC fee percentage. Here's a very sort of simple item activity schedule. So you can see it's split out into the different parts for the house that we made earlier. So the activity schedule can be written either by the employer or the contractor, but it is easier for the employer to compare tenders if they populate the activity schedule to a certain extent with some of the key tasks that need to be undertaken. The key things to be aware of is that, like I say, we're only paying for completed activities, and that's why items 1.2 to 1.4 are monthly items for preliminary costs. If this was a single figure for preliminaries, then under the contract we wouldn't be paying a penny as the employer, that is, until the full prelims activity was complete, which would be at completion. So that's why it's important to make sure that an activity schedule is properly broken down. And it's, like I say, it's also important to remember why it's linked to the program, so that way a contractor should be able to see, and an employer should be able to work out their cost profile for the project from the activity schedule and the program by assessing the two together. And if you look at some of the other items, they could be broken down further. For example, the single item for superstructure could be broken down into ground floor, first floor, to aid payment. So, there are things I say that you need to carefully consider when identifying these. The contractor has to identify all of the associated processes involved in completing an activity. So, for example, with the decoration item, the contractor will need to set paints and tools, potentially hire painting and decorating. Subcontractor would have to manage the works on site and monitor the quality of the works in line with the contract. But all the employer has to do is pay when the activity is complete. And the contract also allows for the activity schedule to be revised, which Mike has already alluded to, and whether that's due to a compensation event or simply the contractor changing a planned method of working, perhaps. For example, the contractor might decide to break up the decorating activity so that rather than waiting for the building services to be complete, they want to get an undercoat of paint in elsewhere and get the services installed and then complete the painting. So it's not unusual for the activity schedule to be revised. In all honesty, it's not unusual at tender stage for a contractor to submit a summarised activity schedule and then revise this into a fuller list of activities should they be awarded the contract. I mean, this approach, like I say, is not advised, but we are aware it happens. So, like I say, I would strongly advise that you do break the activity schedule out properly at tender stage. So, should you use an activity schedule or bill of quants? It's very much sort of up to what you're comfortable with. There are a lot of advantages to both. So, an activity schedule, for example, has some advantages in that it can save a great deal of time preparing a tender package. You don't have to issue measurement and quantity. The issue, of measurement and quantities sits with the contractor, and the assessment of valuations on a monthly basis can be done quickly because it's a case of has the activity been complete? If it has, payment is due, and you move on. However, bills of quantities aren't without their benefits. While it does mean that drafting the tender package takes longer, if the bill of quantities undermeasures the work to be done, then the employer is liable and the assessments of valuations takes longer. But it can make tendering more attractive as it saves contractors having to produce their own bills of quantities, and it also the process of producing a bill of quantities does tease out a lot of ambiguities and issues within the tender package prior to issue. So there are advantages to both, and like I say, it's very much a case of what suits the project best is basically the route that you should take and the way you should go in picking your contract option and whether it's a activity schedule or bill of quantities. I'm just going to hand back to Mike now to talk about compensation events in a bit more detail.
Okay, thanks a lot, Phil. So the compensation event, which is the thing that all project managers end up being focused on because it impacts on cost. I mean, number one thing to be aware of, so compensation events in NEC3 are of cost and time. So what is the impact to the programme of the compensation event? This is really important, particularly if the contractor wishes to claim extra prelims or if delayed damages are part of the contract. So whilst the focus is always on the cost, never forget about the time element when you're agreeing compensation events. A second thing to be aware of, so the notification, assessment and implementation of compensation events is a completely separate activity to implementing a change to the works information. And sometimes we do see contractors trying to hold up enacting a change to the works information until the costs are agreed. And I can understand the reasons why you'd want to do that, because you may well feel that you're exposed financially until that cost is agreed, but it's not how the contract works, and it's actually dangerous to the contractor because it does give the PM an opportunity to say the contractor's delayed the project if they've not been undertaking the change to the works information basically as soon as it's been issued. And then number three, there is a specific and fairly lengthy compensation event process within the contract, which we're not going to go into the full detail of it today, but it explains timescales and it explains how compensation events are to be priced and assessed. So failure to adhere to the process if you end up in a formal dispute isn't going to help your case. Now, the contract as referred to previously can be admin heavy and particularly relating to compensation events, but don't skip on the paperwork at this stage because it will cause you issues down the line. And ultimately, one kind of really kind of key underlying point is the prices and completion data can only be changed by a compensation event. So if the situation encountered is not on the list of compensation events, the prices and the completion data do not change. So if the employer is aware of a risk that they wish to take on, they should detail it in the Z clause of the contract as an additional compensation event. Otherwise, and we do see situations where, you know, a contractor comes with the situation where they believe they're entitled to extra money, and we can't tie it to any of the clauses within 60.1. So we have to say, well, that's not a compensation event unless you can identify it. This isn't a exhaustive list, but just kind of giving an example of some of the perhaps the more common sort of subsections of 60.1, which is the list of compensation events. The first one, which is by far the most common, is the project manager giving the instruction changing the works information, so changing that wall from blue paint to red paint. It may well be the compensation event is actually zero in that case. You know, you presume the paint's the same cost. The time to paint the wall will be the same unless the wall's already been painted and has to be repainted. There's no actual cost or time impact, but it creates the compensation event for it to be assessed by both the contract and the PM, even if the answer is ultimately zero. Some of the other ones we've got there, so certain physical conditions is one that we often see. The physical conditions are detailed within the site information, and there's also certain expectations that a competent contractor will undertake their own investigations with regard to a site. But if something has happened out of left field, which is beyond that's what's expected or what's in the SI, then that can be a compensation event. Weather measurements is another one that we don't see too often, particularly in terms of building. I think it's maybe a little bit more prevalent on the civil engineering side, but basically it's expected that the contractor allows for what's termed a 1 in 10 year event. So anything more sort of extraordinary than that can be claimed as a compensation event under the contract. And an event which prevents the contractor completing the works which neither party could prevent. And I think we've seen some contractors referring to COVID almost as something under that one once or twice. So the compensation procedure, in theory, is a quick procedure to value change during this period of the contract and not after completion. So it should be that when you get to completion, within a few weeks, you've also agreed the cost. In reality, that doesn't always happen, and that's why actually under NEC4 they've also brought in the final account feature. So there shouldn't be any need for this under NEC3 or NEC4. If both parties have followed the contract correctly, then the prices should be agreed in a timely manner. However, reality has shown us that this isn't always the case. People do get hung up agreeing compensation events, delays arise. So the final account facility in NEC4 is a backstop mechanism that's been brought in to formally allow an agreement on cost. I think the other thing to pick up on this slide, we're talking about there's a clear timetable, which can be extended by agreement between the parties, but there's a timetable for notifying, evaluating, implementing compensation events, and it kind of encourages. Again, it's all about encouraging the highlighting the agreement of compensation events as the job progresses, rather than saving them all to the end. One of the kind of the key ones here, that first bullet point. So, if the contractor fails to notify an existing or expected compensation event within 8 weeks of becoming aware of it, they're not entitled to claim for that event unless the PM should have notified the contractor of the event but failed to do so. So, you know, if the contractor knows that they've had an issue on site and they're thinking, right, I'm going to keep that in my back pocket, and then towards the end of the job, if I know I'm not going to make a profit on this, I'm going to throw that in as a claim. That's not going to work. You know, the PM can respond and say you're actually time barred under that item. It does give like a process for the contractor to price compensation events, those to be assessed by the PM, and then the PM to either to agree or ask for compensation events to be revised, or ultimately assess a compensation event themselves. Again, the PM if they do assess a compensation event, should do it fairly in terms of the contract. So in theory, they should actually come up with the same answers as the contractor, unless one or both parties doing something wrong. Okay, I think that's kind of the key thing in terms of compensation events. There's a lot more detail we could go into that one, but we could probably spend a full day on compensation events if we really wanted to. Dispute resolution. So NEC's partnering ethos is designed to try and avoid disputes. So you've got the early warnings, and it really tries to encourage ongoing positive communication between the parties. Disputes are rare, and they're usually resolved via adjudication. It's rare that you actually end up in court. Under NEC3, these have actually been supplemented by additional formal arrangements for dispute resolution. So notably the use of either senior representatives or a dispute avoidance board, depending on the dispute resolution option chosen. By the way, because everyone gets hung up on this, if you're in the UK, you're most likely using W2 in terms of your dispute resolution. So just if you're drafting a contract and you're wondering which one to put down, let's check, but that's probably the one you're going to go for. The items under NEC3 are an evolution of the contract, reflecting common practice. So the use of senior representatives, it's not unusual in if the PM and the contractor representatives working on a scheme, if they can't agree a major issue, it's not unusual for them to refer to someone more senior within their organisation. So it just gives a formal mechanism for that to happen, really. And then looking at subcontractors, there's no formal process within the contract for naming or nominating subcontractors. The contract is clear that regardless of whether subcontractors are used or not, the contractor is treated as though the main contractor, or the contractor I should say, is delivering the works. So the contractor can't use the excuse of a subbie not performing or not managing the subbie very well as a reason why there's the responsibility still sits with the contractor. The NEC, as I say, is silent on naming subcontractors, which doesn't mean that you can't do it. A sensible approach, and I believe is so in our sort of template contracts, is we ask the contracts are back to back, so it's NEC3 down the supply chain, not just with the employer and the main contractor. There's also one that we've started using more and more in terms of project bank accounts. So we have that set so that certainly on our larger contracts we can pay the key suppliers direct, which it does depend on the contract. It depends on the organisations involved, but on some schemes we have seen some positive response from subcontractors for being paid directly from the ultimate client rather than via the supply chain. And I think the council has done some research to identify that actually we can see some savings in terms of the subcontractors offering better prices for being paid via a project bank account rather than through a traditional process. So that kind of concludes the main feature. Now we're slightly ahead of over on time, but we've got a big chunk of Q&A, so I'm not too worried about that. I'm going to hand over to Phil now to talk a little bit more just about the choice of NEC as opposed to other forms of contract.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I mean, we've touched on a lot of this already, so it probably won't be a particularly long section about why NEC. And I know we did sort of touch on before that the other forms of contract like JCT are widely used and they are perfectly good, but this is part of the reason why, or a few of the reasons why we think NEC is better for us as an organisation. So, I mean, first of all, it's endorsed for public sector use by central government. We personally believe that it's very flexible, it's clear, and it's a lot simpler to understand because of the plain English and the very simple structure of it. I mean, it is worth noting that if you look at the core clauses, there's only about 15 to 20 pages of the core clauses in NEC, which might surprise you that it's that short when you think about all of the different scenarios that it covers and everything that could happen on a construction project. But to me, it just shows that a contract doesn't have to be 150 pages long to set everything out. you know, it can be done quite simply and quite clearly. It does use objective tests, so as Mike said before, you know, about the list of compensation events, there's a very clearly defined list of compensation events that are objective. So like the weather compensation event, it is a 1 in 10 year event, and it sets out how that is calculated. In terms of ground conditions, you know, it's a case of, you know, what is in the site information and so on. So it does try to keep things very simple, by using these objective tests that clearly then delineate where the risk, not only where the risk sits, but where the boundary of that sort of, where it goes from being something that should have been allowed for to something that is an employer risk, and it does become a compensation event. And it's very consistent with a lot of initiatives to improve performance in construction. So as I mentioned right back at the start, it's meant to be a collaborative contract. It has this ethos built into it that's all about improving the contract administration, contract management process, and it's designed to try to facilitate good project management. I mean, Mike's touched on like the early warning process and working through things in a collaborative way through risk reduction meetings, the things like that, where you're trying to work together as a team to deliver the project, rather than have this adversarial relationship where it's a case of, well, none of that is my fault or my issue as an employer. It's up to you as a contractor to deal with it, and off you go, you know, and you bear the cost of that. So like I say, it is there to help improve performance. I say, just touched on the collaborative working, the application of PM procedures, again, to support effective project delivery, the detailed program, and subject to regular revisions and acceptance, again, should help to know where the project's at, where your float is, where the risks are. It could even potentially help identify early warnings if float is being used up early on, that you need to maybe look at, is there anything there that can be rescheduled or restacked later down on the project in order to achieve completion. And as Mike's mentioned as well, there's the things for time scales for agreements of changes and compensation events and so on. So it tries to sort of really drive this sort of project management process. And I mean, if we consider the 4 key factors, you've got time, you know, that focus on program should ensure the project is finished on time. Fact that the cost is kind of set, and payment terms are defined, so hopefully you have more certainty around cost. Quality, you know, focuses on defects rectification, and there's provisions in there for how defects are dealt with, so hopefully you should end up with a better quality product, and also a mechanism for dealing with any residual defects. And finally, risk. The contract is better at dealing with risk because of this collaborative work and because of the early warnings, because you're working together. And it's just to finally, I'm just going to re-emphasize these few points, that the contract needs to be proactively managed. It should not sit on the desk and just be left or picked up when you want to hit the other party with something, you know, where a problem has arisen. If it's not proactively managed or properly understood, you know, problems can arise from the outset, which I think we did talk about earlier in the Q&A before the break. It does require careful drafting of your works information, or in NEC4 your scope, because that's setting out what it is that you want. If you have a poorly defined works information or sort of document, or set of documents, you're not setting the contract off on the best footing, and you're opening the door for compensation events and so on throughout the life of that particular contract. There is sort of still a lack of industry awareness even now, you know, as I said, even though it's been around since 1991, it is sometimes still seen as the new contract on the block, or it's also, as Mike alluded to, it's something that if the project manager or someone in the project team, either on the employer side or the contractor side, if they're not familiar with NEC, it can lead to problems. But hopefully, if you're able to work together collaboratively, you can help and train that person, or show them how to what the contract requires them to do in order to undertake their role. And finally, you know, sort of disputes often do get resolved by adjudication, so findings remain private. So there are certain potential issues there of, you know, problems that happen on one project being repeated on other projects. But the advantage of adjudication is that you're not having to go through a very lengthy or expensive litigation, you know, sort of taking things to court. I mean, if you're engaging lawyers, solicitors, or whatever, you can be talking tens of thousands of pounds before you've even kind of actually spoken to the other party about the dispute. So that is a positive. That's hopefully through the use of NEC you should be able to avoid costly disputes through litigation. So I'm just going to hand you back to Mike now for the final bit about the changes to for NEC4, and then we'll go to the Q&A session.
Thanks, Phil. So just to kind of canter through some of the headline changes, and you know, I will kind of highlight, you know, it's worth, you know, if you're a experienced NEC3 practitioner, you know, NEC4 is very much an evolution. It's not a revolution. You know, you know, I've been through the NEC4 sort of accreditation course, the extension course. Phil's going through it shortly. It's you know, there's a few sort of new features. Some of them are more tweaks, really, more than anything. Couple of new contracts in the mix now. So as Phil sort of referred to early on, it is a suite of contracts. There's now a design, build, and operate contract for clients who want a single supplier to do that whole life process for them. There's also an NEC4 alliance contract, which kind of takes partnering a step further. You know, it's a single contract for the client, I should say, to engage multiple parties to deliver what the works are. I know, you know, we was involved in some of the consultation for the drafting of NEC4, and it's been very much, you know, it's been taking the great things about NEC3 and improving on some of the bits that maybe haven't worked quite as intended over time. You know, as with everything, it's a learning process, and as we've seen with NEC4, it's been revised. You know, there's been a couple of tweaks since its original launch in 2017. So to try and make sure it's fully up to date and it's taking up that best practice on. I think some of the, well, not some, I think the revisions are certainly positive when I've looked at them. They make the contract a little bit fairer, and they remove some of the grey areas. One of the ones which, you know, I won't say it's all good for the PMs. You know, no longer can PMs leave programs unassessed. It picks up on that, and if you haven't responded to a program similar to a compensation event, if you don't respond to a submitted program within timescales, it becomes treated as accepted. So there's elements like that which really kind of just improve on the project management of the contract. Early warning provisions. So as mentioned earlier, the risk register has been renamed the early warning register just to make it a bit clearer for people. I've already mentioned about programs, and there's new provisions providing for treated acceptance where the PM doesn't respond to a program. There's some standardization of terms, so the employer becomes client, working information becomes scope. So again, it just kind of makes it a bit clearer. There are more facilities to improve collaboration. So there's additional procedure, including the identification of opportunities by either party. I can see Gabrielle asked a question in terms of alternative products. I'll answer that question in due course, but the answer to it will be different under NEC4 actually because of that. Early contractor involvement is included as a secondary option to be chosen. There's also a new secondary option to specifically support the use of information models and digital engineering models, which is, you know, obviously more and more commonplace nowadays. There's more extensive formal kind of processes in terms of dispute negotiation, dispute avoidance, and it's all to try and ultimately keep us away from, you know, ending up in court with each other. It is to try and encourage the discussion and reach agreement or reach an acceptance that can be done if at all possible. And again, it's all for me, wholly positive stuff. It's, you know, I'm pleased to have it in there, and it probably reflects the informal practice that we was probably doing anyway. In terms of financial agreements, so for payment applications and final accounts, there's procedures there to aim to reach agreements on the final amount due. So as I mentioned earlier, in terms of final accounts, so hopefully schemes aren't sort of dragging on for months after completion. You know, we'll try and encourage that to be bottomed out. Partner has been renamed collaboration to better reflect the intent. There's now an option for a retention bond rather than a pure sort of figure or pure percentage for retention. We've got additional sort of a core clause for confidentiality, which is beneficial. Communication. So I mean, I don't think it was a major issue in the past, but the way the communication under NEC3, it basically said that, you know, communications had to be in a format that could be read, copied by the parties. So, you know, you could not have a verbal instruction, for example, but you could have an instruction, you know, written down on a piece of paper. It could be an email, it could be a WhatsApp message, you know, it could be a text message. I mean, that's not recommended, but in theory it could be. It kind of gives the opportunity under NEC4 to define what the communication system is going to be. So, you know, for example, in our organisation, we tend to use email and Autodesk BIM 360 docs for our project management. You know, if you use, you know, and I know there is project management software out there which you can use to help support the administration of contracts, you could specify that you will use this system. So it does all that. Quality. So one of the things that, you know, has kind of is an issue on some schemes is under NEC3, you know, both the supervisor and the contractor are responsible for identifying defects and notifying of them. Now, in reality, many contractors don't like to notify of defects because they see it as a failing to highlight to the other party, look at the things that we got wrong. I mean, there's even some kind of comments on some projects that the supervisor is effectively used as the quality management for the contractor, which I think is a little bit unfair. But you know, we do sort of have that seen sometimes. Basically, under NEC4, there is a specific section requiring the contractor to prepare and issue a quality management system and plan. So we should see how they are going to manage quality on the project. Schedules of cost components have been simplified, so that, you know, there was 2 schedules under NEC3. There's now just the one. Same for fee percentages. So there used to be a fee percentage for effectively works delivered by the main contractor versus works delivered by subcontractors. There's now just one fee percentage, which it just makes it a little bit simpler to administer, which is again good. And that's, you know, that's a very, very, very high level canter through the NEC4 main changes. You know, if you was using the contract, you'd want to go through a bit more of an in-depth training session on that specifically, but that's kind of the key points. So I think with that we're not too far off the program actually in terms of timescales. We'll turn to the Q&A and kind of work our way through those. Now I think we've just had brilliant. Yeah, we've got just had a few ones come through, so we'll work our way through these. I have been previously the ones that we answered before the breaks. I did delete those questions off just to kind of keep it tidy. I'll leave the rest of them on now, just in case anyone wants to refer to them. But let's see. So we've answered the one from Sam. So the second one that we've got was, if a contractor proposes a cheaper alternative to an item in the working information under options A or B, would the cost saving be split between the client and the contractor, or does the contractor pocket it if it meets the specification standards? So it's an interesting question, this, and there is a bit of a wrinkle of this in terms of public procurement law. So under the contract, if the contractor proposes a cheaper alternative, so say you've specified, I don't know, you specified an IKEA table and they've specified an Argos table, and I'm assuming the Argos table is cheaper. What would happen is the project manager would issue a change to the works information, changing from an IKEA table to an Argos table. I'm not saying that Argos tables are of less quality. I'm sure they're both very good. And then that would trigger a compensation event, which would then be assessed and be implemented. So actually, the saving, if there is a saving, should wholly end up with the employer. Whether that actually happens or not is down to how the compensation event, how well it's been assessed effectively. But all the saving actually ends up with the employer. Now, that's assuming that you've got something that's been fully detailed. So, the works information is detailing a specific product. Now, if it's the situation where we've got a performance specification, the contractor can obviously, they may price the job expecting to use product A, but if they find out that product B meets the performance specification, they've never told us what product A was in the first place, they've just given us a price for it, then they could change products and give us that cheaper product without us knowing really, and they would pocket all that saving. Now, the wrinkle I referred to earlier in terms of public procurement, so under public procurement, you can't, it's very, very difficult to specify a specific product without saying or equally approved or allow accepting alternatives, and that is within our standard documentation, so that if we specify a certain product, it does say, I believe it's under WIA 10 of our standard documentation from memory, it does give that option for a contractor to propose alternatives, and if they can find an alternative which is truly equivalent, so it meets all the sort of performance requirements and all the specifications and everything of what we specified, then we have to accept it, and it won't be classed as a change to works information effectively. I have even had it on a job where we specifically wanted a certain product because of maintenance reasons, and there's justifiable reasons why we wanted a particular product. The contractor actually came up with an alternative which was truly absolutely fine, perfectly, it performed exactly the same way. What we actually did on that job, and I'm not entirely convinced that we administered it correctly, but what we did was we issued a PMI to stick to the original, basically to stick to the original specification. Now, in hindsight, whether that was the right thing to do or not, I'm not entirely sure, but he was basically wanted to acknowledge, yes, Mr. Contractor, you have found and you've allowed for a cheaper but perfectly identical product. We want what we specified for our reasons, which was for maintenance and for for replacing products if we needed to down the line. So that's how we actually tackle that one. So yeah, so as kind of mentions, that actually all the saving actually comes to the employer unless otherwise. So next question we've got is, if say clauses allow the inclusion of provisional sums, are these activities included on the program? Well, it depends on the Z clause and on what the exact content of it. I mean, so I can only really answer in terms of the Z clauses that we use. And I did I had a quick look at our template contracts when this question come through, and it does say that the activities for the provisional sums should be included on the program as I read it. So it certainly should be included within the activity schedule. And I don't really see how you can not include it on the program if you know it's an activity. It may be that it may be a difficult one for you to include, but this should be an attempt to include it certainly. And if you've got any questions about it, then during the tender process you should be asking questions of the employer as to what allowance should be made. And then so the next question, which is down, is on ERYC schemes, would varying the provisional activities result in a compensation event? Which yes, it would be. We've added, as mentioned, we've suggested elsewhere, we've added a Z clause, which is for the basically instructing a provisional sum, should I say. That is a compensation event. The assessment of the compensation event is subject to the contract, and that will go through. Have you got anything you want to add to that, Phil?
Yeah, I was just going to say that there is a compensation event for correcting an assumption. Effectively, like a project manager could issue a compensation event, but without all the full details to say, I want you to want to do this change, but these are the assumptions for you to build up your price. And then when the contractor is actually delivering it, you would then revise the value of that compensation and based on the actual things encountered. So it could be, say you instruct them to, going back to Mike's example of car parks, it might be we've designed one for 100 spaces. We decide, well, there's a bit of land next to it, we could add 20 extra spaces. And if you don't have the ground conditions or investigation report, you could say assume it's the same as the rest of the site. The contractor would provide their quote for acceptance and then proceed with the work. If the ground conditions turned out to be worse, then you would use that additional C to revise the previous compensation event to basically so the contractor is not penalised for the assumptions which have come from the client. And it's very much similar with the provisional sums, is that those items are things that aren't necessarily fully designed or fully identified. So whilst we would want it, and that's why the contractor can't price them in there, or potentially can't price them in their tender. So as an employer, we want to have that ability to basically correctly identify the impact of that provisional sum on cost on the programme, and therefore you would effectively have to issue a compensation event to instruct or to activate the provisional sum. I mean, you'd also have to issue a compensation event because it's effectively a project manager instruction that you're saying, I want you now to take out that or undertake that work. And so that is again something that kind of kicks that off, that turns that provisional sum or that provisional activity into a compensation event. I mean, there is some benefit to doing it that way as well, is that because the pricing mechanism for compensation events and how you deal with the impact on programme, dealing with them as compensation events, effectively you then piggyback on the back of that that process that's already in the contract that everyone's familiar with, so you're not having to design your own. So it does remove ambiguity or any potential problems there as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Phil. The next question is, so how does the financial risk balance between the contractor and employer compare to a design and build contract? Now, I think that's referring to a JCT design and build contract, because then we say about, is it a way of bridging the gap between D&B and standard building contract? I must admit, I don't really know the answer to that, because we're talking about comparing the financial risk on the NEC versus a JCT, and I don't. It's a difficult one to answer that, because it depends on the exact situations and the nature of what you're building as to the better choice of contract. And particularly under NEC, the NEC ECC contract, that single thing can be fully sort of in-house designed or designed by architects and the design team versus fully contracted design. So it's a really difficult one to kind of answer that one, I'm afraid. So I don't really have an immediate answer for you. I don't know if you've got anything, Phil.
I mean, I'm not familiar with JCT, so I can't really tell you what the differences are. But if you are familiar with JCT, then maybe a short explanation of how it works in NEC might help. Effectively, if you're doing a design and build contract, as Mike says, as the employer, you have to define the elements that the contractor is to design and set some parameters, and the contractor is then responsible for coming up with a design and producing their own works information to deliver that element. And basically the risk of say if the contractor's design is substandard, or if it doesn't meet the employer's requirement, that risk rests with the contractor. So there's a hierarchy of documents whereby the information issued by the employer has precedence over the information produced by the contractor. So if there was, say, an ambiguity that arose where because there was a conflict between the employer's works information and the proposal put forward by the contractor would have to revise their proposal to then be in line with the works information, and they would bear the brunt of any cost or time implications of that change. Now, if it's the other way around and there's an ambiguity in the employer's information and the contractor's proposals do meet an interpretation of the employer's works information, then you would end up with that being an employer's risk, and you'd have to go down the CE route to basically instruct a change, or potentially look at accepting the contractor's design despite it not being quite what you'd initially envisaged.
That's wonderful. Phil, can you just we'll go through questions, but can you just drop back to the slide showing the A to F, the risk profile between employee and contractor? That's what the question was referring to. So yeah, it's a little that's the one. So yeah, so just looking at this in terms of design and build contract. I mean, design and build can actually go pretty much anywhere along that line, can't it? You know, I've done design and builds. Well, most of my design and builds have been option A, but quite equally could be an option C, or it could even be an option E. And particularly if you've got like really urgent works, you know, that's the way that you do it in order to save as much time as possible. So yeah, feel free. We'll be popping up our email addresses at the end of this presentation, by the way. So do feel free if anyone's like, if you want to ask any questions in more detail, you know, we're quite happy to take stuff, and we'll do our best to respond in due course. Josh asks, do you use contract management software to keep track of where you are in any particular contract? We currently use Autodesk BIM 360 and a set of standard templates to manage our work. So I'm aware there's various pieces of software out there to use, but currently sort of in our organisation we don't use any. The next question. So what are your thoughts on contract amendments, especially when lawyers change / add to core clauses? Does this sit better with your qualifications, Phil, for you to answer that one? I mean, I have a gut feeling, which I'll happily expel at length, but I feel that you might give a more professional response to that.
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one. I mean, in East Riding, we have amended the contract. Like, we have a number of Z clauses in in our sort of contract document, so I can't say that no, do not put them in. I think you do have to know the NEC inside and out before you start making those amendments. Like, the people who've drafted the Z clauses that we use are very experienced in the NEC, so they understand the implications of the changes that they're putting forward. Because if you write a Z clause badly, which we see all of the time, you put yourself in a worse position than if you'd not bothered at all. And also, people sometimes write in Z clauses where they just don't understand the contract and are trying to transfer a risk which either should sit with the employer or should sit with the contract, and they're trying to pass it over, which is wrong. Or we've seen them where they've written a Z clause trying to transfer a risk to the contractor that under the core clauses already sits with the contractor. And then if the incident does arise, how to deal with it is then muddied, because are you following what's in the Z clause, or are you following what's in the core clauses? And you basically introduce a conflict and ambiguity that then make it difficult to deal with that situation. So I suppose the end result would be, I would say, only include Z clauses if you are very knowledgeable on NEC, that you can fully understand the impacts, and I would say keep them as sparingly as possible. Because another thing to consider is that the more that you amend it, the less familiar the other party is going to be, and the more likely that they could trip themselves up to not necessarily fully understanding the contract terms that they've put in. And as a final point, we also have to be wary of putting in contract terms which are unreasonable. Because if it did go to court, there is case law out there that basically says that you cannot impose an unreasonable contract condition onto another party. and would basically strike it out and say, well, the intention is there, you know, but there is no way that a diligent contractor could actually comply with that, and therefore, you know, it wouldn't stack up in the courts, and it could end up in a very costly dispute and a lot of wasted time and money. So to say, I would recommend keeping them to a minimum for that reason.
That's perfect. Thanks, Phil. A lot better than I was going to say, certainly. Josh's question is next. He says, how are early warnings formally identified to each party, or early spottings of defects? So, I mean, contractually, it's, you know, it's in a form where they can be read and copied and transmitted. So, you know, that's kind of up to yourself to choose. So, you know, we have a Word document template that we email or we upload to Autodesk BIM 360 Docs to notify the other party of an early warning or a defect. I mean, in all reality, in terms of management of it, I mean, certainly in terms of an early warning, because I know that early warnings can sometimes come across as being confrontational. I tend to telephone the other party first to say, just to let you know, I'm sending an early warning. It's about this, you know, don't take it personally. It's just I'm really concerned about X, Y, and Z. But it's really important to then follow that up with that formal, whatever that is. It can be a document, it could be a shared spreadsheet even, or you could be using a piece of contract management software as alluded to previously. And that's the same for your early warnings and for your defects. I know our supervisors, they on their tablets, they have particular reporting apps that they use to issue defects, where they can take photos and highlight locations and all that kind of side to it. Yes, and just so you're going through a refurbishment program, you've got challenges in terms of both the contractor and the PM following through on issues picked up. I don't know if you've got any sort of additional advice, Phil.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to sort of say is that in terms of trying to engage the contractor and the project program manager, it might be an idea to call a risk reduction meeting, you know, sort of, because if you're issuing early warnings, that is in theory the next step, that you should have a risk reduction meeting to then look at that, and that would potentially be a way to try and bring those parties together and bring them on side and get them following the contract. I mean, the other thing I'd just say is that in terms of spotting defects and so on, whilst the construction works are being undertaken, it is up to the contractor when and how they fix those defects. The defect correction period only kicks in after completion. So we have this a lot where project managers or clients, if they're being shown around a building, can get very hung up on the fact that they're spotting defects, or, you know, as they're going around a partially completed project, and then weeks later they'll go back for another visit and it's not been fixed or mended. But that's perfectly fine. You know, they don't have, just because we've identified something doesn't mean that they have to deal with it there and then. You know, that is up to the contractor of how to manage their resources, how to plan the project. It could be down to the availability of supply of spare parts or replacement parts, any number of reasons. So it can be concerning to see defects, but it's very much a case of don't get hung up on them unless they are going to be things that are not going to be rectified. You know, if you say a day before the handover, then you kind of need to be a bit more concerned that the contractor isn't dealing with the defects correctly. But as Mike said, in theory, under complete the terms of the contract, completion only happens when all of the works have been done and all of the defects that would impact on the employer taking ownership have been resolved. So the way to deal with that would be that you would then go back and say, well, we're not certifying completion because you've not resolved these defects, and then you're into delayed damages. So there is a contractual mechanism to deal with it, but that's only really towards the end of the contract in terms of the contract period. Sorry.
That's brilliant, thank you. Phil, do you want to pop down to the last slide and then people can see our email addresses if they want them out later on. So the last question that we've got, so unless any others pop through in the next minute or so. So the last one we've got is, I'm aware the NEC does not allow nominated contractors. Are there any ways of naming specific subcontractors, and how does East Riding allow for this? Well, I mean, the NEC is silent in terms of nominated contractors. I mean, the way that we address it at East Riding is we would typically name a contractor within the works information, and we would only do that if there's a specific reason for doing it. Again, touching on the public procurement regulations referred to earlier. So it may well be, for example, that there are contractors which are on our cyclical maintenance contracts. So there's a benefit to using the same contractor to construct a particular piece of the works as is going to maintain it down the line. So there's only those kind of reasons why we would look to name a contractor, but that's pretty much the way that we would tackle it. I don't know if you've got any other approaches, Phil.
Yeah, I'd say from our perspective, being a public body, it tends to be quite rare that we do something like this because of the way the regulations are set out that we have to abide by, which are all focused on basically kind of maintaining a competitive market effectively. So we're not allowed to specify contractors or cherry pick contractors because you're distorting the market or you're potentially not spending public money correctly. As Mike said, we do occasionally do it for technical reasons. Like we might, as Mike said, we have a number of separate cyclical contracts for repair and maintenance. So we might do it, say if we were doing internal refurbishments to a large number of council properties, council houses, and we've got a supplier already set up to maintain the central heating systems. What we would potentially do is say if there's any central heating work, it's to be done by that supplier. It basically enables a smoother sort of delivery, because the alternative for us would be we'd have to say to the contractor, you get to a certain point, we as the employer then have to take the site back to let our cyclical contractor onto site to then deliver that part of the work, and then they come off site and then we hand the site back to the main contractor, and that creates a whole load of risks around the delivery, the timing, if something was to be damaged, which contractor did it. Whereas being able to mandate a subcontractor and kind of insert them into the contract, it basically allows or enables that main contractor to work more closely with that subcontractor, and also they maintain responsibility for the site, so it just can be easier around those interfaces, because again you don't have things around preliminary costs for site hoardings or you know, the use of the site compound and things like that. So it can, while it can be awkward, it does produce a lot of benefits to do it that way.
Brilliant. Okay, well that concludes all the Q&A. So that is, you know, that's our presentation. So I sincerely hope everyone's enjoyed it. I think we've enjoyed delivering. It's been nice to do this. I can see we've still got quite a few attendees, so well done to everyone who's made it all the way through. As I say, by all means, if anyone's got any particular more in-depth questions, or if they have a particular situation that they need some consultancy advice on, feel free to email myself or Phil. And again, sort of in terms of G4C, we would sort of really encourage you, if your organisation isn't already engaging with the G4C, there's a lot that can be done in terms of supporting your new entrance to industry. You know, a lot of the people that I work with have been to G4C events and get a lot out of G4C. Yeah, look forward to hearing from you all soon. Thanks again.